It is only 7:30 in the morning and already I've done so much work in the garden. I ended up waking up a little before 3:30 and I just couldn't go back to sleep. So I got out of bed and started doing the dishes and everything else that needed to be done in the kitchen. And then by the time it got daylight, I had already taken care of the animals outside, done all of that. So I figured I'd go ahead and harvest some of the squash out of the garden, because when I was walking by just where the blackberries were on my way to the duck and goose pen, there were so many blackberries, which is insane to me just because last night I picked everything that was out there that was ripe, right? Not too long before the sun went down. And I actually picked in morning and evening. Now today I haven't picked anything yet because I've been busy doing other things, and I figure once the kids wake up they could go do that, since that's kind of their thing and their passion, especially Sam. He loves those blackberries. He's the one who got us started with blackberries and asked us to grow them in the beginning. So that's kind of how we got into it, because we wanted our children to grow something that was important to them and would get them involved in homesteading and growing their own food. And blackberries was it for Sam, which was really cool. So this is where we're at now. We have these 2 quart jars, and what I did, instead of making traditional pickles, because our cucumber plants have not started producing. They've been planted for over a month now. They are about 8 inches to a foot tall, most of them about 8 inches, and they still haven't produced. There's not even the sign of a flower or fruit. They're just starting to get taller, and I think that's because the weather's gone from hot to cool to hot to cool, and cucumbers really need that really warm weather. But I wanted to start them early so that they didn't, I guess, get that nasty bitter taste that cucumbers get when they're in extreme heat and they start getting diseases and everything else. So there's kind of like a fine area for us to grow cucumbers in both the spring and the fall, just to make sure that we're getting them in before it gets too hot outside. And then again in the fall, it's very, very hot until almost October. And then sometimes it's warm through December, sometimes it's not. We'll get occasional cold spurts. So it's just really confusing trying to grow certain warm weather crops here and trying to figure out exactly when for me. So for me, I wanted to start my cucumbers a little early, get them started late March, early April. That way, when the heat finally came through for us, consistently having warm days, those cucumbers would shoot up, and it looks like that's kind of what's starting to happen now. So since we don't have cucumbers ready and our kids are really obsessed with pickles, we're using squash. Now this is not a safe, shelf-stable canning recipe. I'm not putting these on my shelf whatsoever. These 2 jars are going to go in my fridge, and they're going to stay there. They'll probably be gone before the week even finishes. I made one yesterday, and I kid you not, my son fell asleep eating them. I guess he had gotten back up at some point during the night and went in and got a snack and fell asleep eating those pickles. Which, it's not ideal, but it is kind of hilarious that he loved them that much. And so I don't want these to be too vinegary, because that would be not so great. But since this is a quart jar, I will put 8 ounces of this white distilled vinegar in each one, which I am going to measure out. I have this old jar. It used to be a sauce jar, and I just kind of saved it. You can see some water in it because I've started filling it up and using it. But I wanted to kind of show you guys what it is I'm doing, and I didn't really think to show anyone because I was just jamming out to my music and working. But I ended up picking, so I think 8 or 9 squash this morning, and I filled up these 2 quart jars. They're pretty well packed in there, and then I started another quart jar in my fridge. So this is a pretty good amount of squash for one day's harvest. And I harvest them every single day. Sometimes I harvest them twice a day, sort of like you would do okra. Harvest them in the morning and in the evening because they grow so rapidly and you really don't want them to get too big, seedy, or tough. Now, all of these squash, the green squash, are kind of starting to peter out a little bit. I pulled up one the other day that had, it was growing too close to another one, and it didn't look so great. So I pulled it out, and then the ones in the very front around my apple tree, some of them are actually looking kind of sad now. I think one of them has powdery mildew. I'm going to give it probably another couple of days and see what happens, but because those haven't produced as much squash as the rest of them, and there are a lot of small fruits on them. But after a couple of days, if they start kind of petering out as far as fruit production, I'm going to go ahead and pull those out too. There's no sense in trying to grow squash when it stops being that productive. And I know it may sound crazy that my squash is already slowing down in production and it's late April, but for me, I've had squash producing for over a month now, you know. They've just been, we started them indoors, so they were a month ahead, got them out in the garden, so they've just been going. And now that these green squash are starting to kind of slow down on production, all of the smaller squash, our hybrid yellow saffron squash, and our Zephyr squash, I think that it's Zephyr. They're a yellow squash with the last bit of them are green in, so they're really cool looking. Yellow up top, green at the bottom. And the first couple of them come out kind of like a weird yellowish green color, and then after that they get bigger. But the thing about the saffron squash is that they grow a little slowly, and then all of a sudden they're massive and they're too seedy and too big to use. So we have to pick those smaller. And the Zephyr squash, I waited for the first fruit days past what I think I should have, and it just didn't grow very big. And since I have not seen a lot of information on these squash and it's my first time growing them, I'm thinking they're just a much smaller type of squash than these are, and I guess that would make sense. So these are some of my favorite squash right here. Now, where we're at in South Texas, a lot of local stores, especially Hispanic grocery stores, will have them listed as calabaza squash, but Cozell is the actual name of the squash, and I recommend this to anyone just starting out. These are a big squash, they grow well, and honestly, half the time, by the time the flower is pollinated and then falls off the squash, they're already big enough to harvest. So if you're worried about poor pollination, or you're new to this and you don't really know what you're doing, this is an excellent squash just based off the size and texture, how long it lasts. I really love it. It's good for everything. It's good for fresh eating, it's good for pickling, it's good for just about anything you can imagine. I'm even making fruit snacks out of some of the squash, which is pretty cool. So what I did here in these quart jars is I stuffed them as full as I could, and you can see like I'm pressing down, there's not a lot of room up to the lid of the jar. And then instead of using traditional pickle seasoning, I used what I had on hand, which was it's similar to pickling seasoning, except for this one is technically made for steak seasoning, but it has a strong bit of dill in it, and we really like the flavor and to kind of use it for all different things. So I used that because, like I said, these are not a shelf-stable products, and honestly, a lot of seasonings aren't really going to vet even if it was shelf-stable. This is just something that's going into my fridge, and it'll be gone, like I said, in less than a week. So the first thing I'm going to do is on this, it actually says it has an 8, and the cool thing about this jar is it's in ounces, but it's also in milliliters too. So in these quart jars, I'm gonna measure out 8 ounces of vinegar, and this is actually in kind of a spot that's hard to That's actually a little more than 8 ounces, but that's okay. I'm just going to leave the rest of that because I poured slightly more than I meant to into the jar. And same for this one, just going to pour it right into it. I like to put the seasonings on top and then add everything else. Some people like to put it at the bottom of the jar. I just like to do it this way. It falls down and it works for me. So another way that you can do this is putting some hot water in first to kind of melt the sugar and everything. I found that for these, it's really not that big of a deal. But now I am going to go ahead and add warm water to these jars. Now I do want to say this, if you're using a recipe that has more sugar, then you're going to want to put the warm water in probably first to melt that sugar, and then you might put the sugar at the bottom. It's really up to you. For me, what I did is I put a teaspoon and a half of seasoning into each one, and then I put a fourth a cup of sugar into each one because I want them to be a little sweet and kind of offset how strong the vinegar is in these. I did make some the other day without as much sugar. I only used probably half a tablespoon of sugar, and the vinegar was still really strong. So that's why I'm going to make them a little bit sweeter, because I think my boys will enjoy them a lot more. And if I can get them to eat more food out of the garden, not have to go buy an insane amount of store pickles while I'm waiting for the cucumbers to produce so I can actually make shelf-stable pickles, then this works out for me because I can just ferment it and leave it in the fridge. I know that they're eating stuff from our garden, which is really exciting, and it's not going to waste, but also it's saving me a bit of money because I had everything already on hand. The jars, the vinegar, sugar, seasoning, these are all things I keep at my home. And then the squash is just extra from my garden. I've already put gallons and gallons of it into my freezer. And on top of that, we've given it away. I literally gave my husband's boss 8 squash from my garden the other day, and I thought that was really cool. Now he's also shared some really cool things with us too, which is always fun, trading things out with different people. And so this is hot water, not warm. And I'm going to fill it up right to that first line. And you can fill it up a little more. Actually, I think I'm going to fill it all the way up. I don't know why I did it right to the first line. If I was actually canning pickles, I'd fill it up right to the first line. But I'm not. These are going in my fridge. So I want everything to kind of be fully covered. These look really good so far. So you see everything's kind of going down and settling, and I like that. I feel like if you put it on the bottom a lot of times, it just stays there. And I don't want any of that. So again, if this was actually something I was canning for the shelf, I would fill it to right here at the neck of the jar, but it's not. So I'm going to fill it up a little more. That way I know everything's fully covered. Like I said, these are going to hang out in our fridge, so it's really not the end of the world for me. Another thing that's really good to add to these is mustard powder. If you have that, I recommend it. I think I'm also going to make a couple with crushed cayenne red pepper flakes, because I really like spicier food sometimes. Not too spicy, but I like some flavor to it. And I also have an entire jar full of Tabasco peppers that I just set on the counter and let dry from last year's garden. And I think those would be lovely, just dropping a couple of Tabasco peppers or even crushed dried Tabasco into some of these jars. Now I'm going to have to really label those and make it very clear to my boys not to eat those. Last year, one of the Tabasco peppers did not smell spicy like most Tabasco peppers do. And I was like, what's going on here? And I took a bite into it. Let me tell you, that was one of the biggest mistakes I've made in the garden last year. It was so hot, and I was well into biting into it. and starting to chew it up when the heat hit. So as you can imagine, that was a little rough once those seeds really hit my mouth and my tongue. So I'm going to give these a little shake. You don't have to. It's really not necessary, but it does kind of help with the sugar and mixing it in. But truthfully, the sugar was on the top, so it's really dissolved completely because of the hot water. And as it flowed down, it kind of mixed in. Now this one, the sugar did not dissolve. You can see on the bottom, so I'll just shake this a little more. But that's what I'm saying. If you put a large amount of sugar in there, then you would definitely have to put the warm water before the vinegar so that it would dissolve the sugar. But since we didn't, and look at that. So you can see all the seasonings are kind of settling to the bottom. And what I'm going to do is periodically, a couple times a day, I'm going to go in there and just kind of do this, tip it upside down and shake it and let it all mix back together. But it's really not a requirement, it's just something that you can do. And that's it. So they're really simple to make. It's nothing fancy or special. So what I do is add, you can really do it to, I guess, your taste buds, what works for you. But my favorite way to do this is fill it up with a sliced squash. You could do this with cucumbers too. Pack it in as packed as you can get it. Then you can put, for me, I like to put 8 ounces of vinegar into each one. Then I like to put 1/4 cup of sugar and 1.5 teaspoons of whatever seasoning I'm using into them. And then the rest of the way, hot water. And that's going to really help. Now, if you're not using sugar, hot water is not required. And I always forget to leave this out. I do add 1/4 teaspoon of salt. Now, if that's just something about pickles needs a little salt to taste good and to do well, in my opinion. Now, technically with the vinegar and sugar, that's enough preservatives, especially with it being in the fridge. Now, if you're going to make dill pickles, I would kind of look up more of a dill recipe that has a little more salt in it and see what you like. But for me, it just isn't necessary. I like the dill flavoring that's in the seasoning that I'm using, but it's not overpowering. There are a lot of other flavors in it. And so that's what works for us. Now, if you really just don't feel comfortable seasoning everything, you can go to a few stores. You can look it up online. They have it at Walmart, any kind of grocery store, and Tractor Supply. These stores all carry it for sure. And you can find like Miss Wages, dill packets, and there are other brands too. And all you have to do is read the directions on the back and follow it. It's really simple. So like I said, you cannot put these on the shelf. They have not been canned. Even if they were, there's only like 1 or 2 recipes where it's actually like scientifically tested by canning testers, paid for by the company, so that's something to consider. But you can, I think Ball is one of the few companies that does have a recipe for pickled squash. And really fast, let me show you one other thing that I'm doing with a squash that we started the other day that I think is really cool. Okay, so let me move my knife out of the way. So remember when I said, you know what? I don't even remember. So these pickles are what it looks like after 24 hours in being in the fridge. And it hasn't been quite 24 hours. We're just a couple hours shy of it though. So I'm going to say about 24 hours. And I use the same exact seasoning, same exact method. So you see it's really settled to the bottom. But the squash have started to look a little different. And even though the seasoning's at the bottom, the color is kind of like a brownish golden color. It looks different. So the color in all of it looks like this all the way up. And so that means that the seasonings are really starting to soak into the pickles. And this is the jar that my son's already been eating. So they're already a hit. But you'll see that even without them eating some, there will be some space as they kind of start changing texture. They will, and soaking up that liquid, they'll kind of float to the top instead of being at the bottom. Now this is one of my favorite things to do with squash, and it's different, guys. You kind of have to adjust to it if you're an adult and in your mind things are going to taste a certain way. But if you're a kid, they love these. And honestly, I'll eat them. My husband, it's a little weird for him. But then once he starts eating them, he kind of can't stop. So he does not like them like this. He likes them after they're fully dehydrated. And what this is the same exact type of squash, the Cozell squash that I'm using for the pickles, but instead I have peeled it, and my son helped me slice it. We slice these into pieces, so you can see this, how they're sliced up. So some recipes will call and say, you know, do them about, I don't know, 3 inches long and 1.5 to 2 inches wide. We like our slightly bigger, and I didn't really measure these. I just have gotten so used to dehydrating things that I just kind of do it the way that has worked best for us. And in the past, we've used one of those dehydrators from Academy, just the round ones. I have not seen those in recent years, but a couple years ago, my dog chewed it up, to be really honest, and that was frustrating. But also over time, it kind of worked a little bit. So I've been using my oven, which you can set yours on the lowest setting. For me, I think that's like 165 or 170 degrees. And I dehydrate things in that setting, and it's really nice to be able to do anything from jerky, squash, flowers, chives, any kind of herbs or seasonings, things for tea. I mean, you could do anything almost. So it's really nice and convenient. I think there are a lot of people just starting dehydrating who don't realize that you can do it in the oven or how those lowest settings work. And that is okay. Not all of us were taught. Not all of us have that information available to us, and that's what I'm here for, to kind of show you what I'm doing and what works for me, and then you can kind of pick and choose which of this will work for you and what won't. But what I did here, you can use Kool-Aid. A lot of people do that. That's how I originally learned the recipe. But at home, we actually keep powdered Gatorade. Our water tastes absolutely horrible, and powdered Gatorade is one of the few things that we can stand the taste of our city water with. Another thing that is really, really good is using hibiscus leaves. It is the most beautiful magenta color if you use the dehydrated red leaves, and I think they're absolutely amazing. It makes such a beautiful flavoring in tea. It gives it kind of tastes like Kool-Aid, but more of a floral flavor. I don't even know how to explain it. And different types of hibiscus are going to give different flavors. So it's one of my absolute favorites. Now, I use fruit punch Gatorade powder, and I use 3 times what the recipe called for, or what the concentration on the can said. So for a quart jar of fruit punch flavored Gatorade, you would use 1 scoop, and I use 3 scoops to do this. Now, if you're doing a quart of this with Kool-Aid, I would say 1 to 2 packets is probably enough. If you have the type of packets where 1 or 2 do a gallon, I would use that, because the amount that I used is enough for 3 quarts, and I used it in 1 quart. So if that kind of helps a little bit. Technically, if you have a packet of Kool-Aid that does half gallon for 1 packet, it would still work. It just wouldn't be quite as strong. If you have the type where it does 1 packet for a gallon, do not use more than 1 packet. That would be way too much. It would just be overwhelming. Now, the cool thing about this is That fruit punch is already sweetened. So when I mix it in here and I let it set in the fridge, and I made these about the time that I made the pickles, so they're also just around 24 hours it's been in there, and they've already turned the color of the juice, and I tried them. They actually taste like fruit punch. But then after about, I don't know, right before you're done chewing it, about ready to swallow, it starts to taste like squash. So what I'm going to do with this is pour it into a saucepan after a couple of days. Just a cast iron saucepan. You can use any saucepan that you have. And then I'm going to mix in sugar. Make a nice thick sugar syrup. Just add it to the juice and squash. And then after it cooks down really well and the squash gets kind of a translucent color, you'll see it because it'll get really, really soft, but you don't want the squash breaking apart. So you want the squash where it's cooked a little bit in the sugar syrup, but what you don't want is it to be super liquidy, or how squash gets really mushy after a while. And then you're just going to pop it in your oven or dehydrator and let it go until it's done. When it looks dehydrated, it's fine. And you can put it into a jar with an oxygen absorber and it'll keep for quite a while. That's not going to happen with us. I'm going to dehydrate it. This will be gone within 24 hours. I can almost guarantee it. You can also put it in your freezer or fridge if you're not comfortable doing that after it's dehydrated. So it's pretty easy to store. But if you have small kids, it's not going to last that long. Anything that tastes like any kind of juice or candy, it's going to be gone very quickly. And if you have other methods, other juices, homemade juices, any of that, it will work for flavoring the squash, because what you're doing is you're basically creating a brine where the squash is soaking into it. Now, the step of adding the sugar syrup into it and cooking it is not necessary. We just like ours a little sweeter. You can dehydrate it as is. The flavor just won't be quite as strong and it won't be as sweet, and that's fine. If you want to do a little healthier, or even if you prefer using sugar substitutes, all of that is possible. But I want you to understand that it will change the flavor of how it works. So with that being said, this is such a fun thing to make, and I really enjoy it. I'm going to go ahead and get off here. There's still so much to do, and all of my children are still asleep. So this is a great time to kind of get some of the chores like laundry, washing dishes, sweeping and mopping, especially mopping. I do not like mopping when everyone is up because my kids are in bed still. The dog is in bed with the kids, and the cat is on the couch sleeping with my oldest son. So they are all asleep. They are all, doing their own thing and off the floor, which makes it a lot easier for me to get stuff done. So I appreciate you guys hanging out with me early this morning, and just let me go on and on about the fun things I'm doing with the things I'm harvesting in my garden. I really enjoy sharing that because when I first started, I did not know what I was going to do with this. I'm still trying to learn exactly what I'm going to do with everything I harvest. And as I learn and figure that out, I'm sharing it with you guys, because I think anyone else who's kind of in my position, you think like the hardest part is growing all this food, and then you realize like, what am I going to do with it now that I've grown it? I have to learn how to cook it. I have to learn how to preserve it. I have to learn something. So it's really nice to be able to share that knowledge so everyone else is not going crazy searching for it or feeling overwhelmed by their produce like I did. So thank you guys again. I really appreciate all of your support, and I enjoy reading your comments and your ideas and kind of learning things from you guys as well.